Hey there, we're continuing on now with our study of the star sign of Virgo in the Abrahamic covenant. And before we get started, I want to point out that the story of Abraham and the Abrahamic covenant is really it's the story of four men. And I guess you could even include five if we want to go all the way down to Christ himself. But the story of the Abrahamic covenant is, at least in this point in our study, associated with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as well as King David, who comes about 1,000 years after the time of Abraham. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are often referred to as the fathers. Sometimes they're referred to as the forefathers in other parts of Scripture, particularly in the New Testament, and also as the patriarchs. And we group them together not just because Jacob was Isaac's son or because Isaac was Abraham's son. We group them together specifically because God spoke the promises of the Abrahamic covenant directly to Abraham, directly to Isaac, directly to Jacob, and again, about 1,000 years or so later, to King David specifically. And King David, of course, has his own story under the star sign of Capricorn. Now, we're going to pick up just where we left off after our introduction last time. I want you to go to Genesis chapter 12. And as we go through this, and I think probably what we're going to end up doing over the next couple of lessons is we're going to be blending together the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, of course, they happen sequentially, but because we're talking about father, son, and grandson, obviously there's time overlap where all of these people are actually alive at the same point. But we're going to deal with this progressively, and we'll talk mostly about Abraham's story, and then we'll move into Isaac and Jacob. But again, it's a little difficult to separate them when we're just reading through the different chapters. So Genesis 12, chapter 1 says, "Now the Lord had said to Abram, 'Get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house to a land I will show you.'" Now, if you have not read through Genesis 12 before or much of the Old Testament, you might be wondering why he's called Abram here rather than Abraham. Well, simple story, and we'll get to it later, is that God changed his name at some point. He changed it from Abram to Abraham. But this is, of course, before that part of the story. He says, "Go to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing," or the Septuagint says, "you shall be blessed. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him. And it's important to notice that that's the past tense there, because God had already spoken to him prior to the events of what we're reading here. And I'll show you that coming up in a second. So Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Then Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people whom they had acquired in Haran, and they departed to go to the land of Canaan. So they came to the land of Canaan. Abram passed through the land to the place of Shechem, as far as the terebinth tree of Moreh, and the Canaanites were in the land. Now you'll notice again that Sarah is not called Sarah, she's called Sarai. Her name was later changed as well, a different part of the story. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your seed I will give this land." And there he built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. And he moved from there to the mountain east of Bethel, and he pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. So Abram journeyed, going on still toward the south. Now, I want to put this together on a map just to give you some kind of a mental impression. And you can see if you go out on the internet, or if you have Bible software, that usually they contain maps, and sometimes even in the back of your Bible, if your Bible does contain maps in a section, quite often they will have a map of the Old Testament, typically called the time of the patriarchs, and you'll see arrows going all over the place. As you know, this is Abraham's journey. Well, I'm going to reproduce part of that just in very simplistic forms, but the first thing I want you to notice is that in Genesis chapter 12, we're immediately thrust into the middle of Abraham's story. Abram, here being 75 years old when he leaves Haran, he's only, what we would consider to be middle-aged, because he died, I believe, was somewhere around 170, 175 years old. And so at this point, he's only kind of like a middle-aged guy. Same thing with Sarai. But in Haran, this is where Abraham's father, Terah, died. And he died in a city that bore the name of his dead son Haran. If you remember, going back when we did the genealogies, Abram had a brother named Haran, and Haran died. But at this point, Abram's 75 years old. He's living in Haran, even though that's not where he was born. Abram is married to Sarai. And according to Josephus, I believe I mentioned this in another lesson, Abram had adopted Haran's son, Lot, who was Abram's nephew, and he took him in as if he was his own son. But based on some other verses in Acts chapter 7, let me just put this up on the screen there. In Acts chapter 7, when Stephen was standing before the Jewish council, he was giving a defense of his faith as well as the gospel and the new covenant. He stated that God had actually spoken to Abram 5 years prior to him leaving Haran when he lived in Mesopotamia. So we're going to, as we go through this, what I want to do is I want to track all the different iterations or all the different times that God showed up and spoke to Abraham or Abram and gave some element of the Abrahamic covenant. And what we'll see over time, if we include the time that God spoke to Abram while he was still living in Ur in Mesopotamia, if we consider that the very first instance, we'll see that God actually appeared and spoke to Abram 8 different times. And each time he gave him a different look, a little bit progressive knowledge and revelation of the Abrahamic covenant. But just to prove my point, if you want to take your Bible and go to Acts chapter 7 in verse 1, this again is where Stephen is giving his defense to the council. So Acts chapter 7 verse 1, then the high priest said to Stephen, are these things so? And he, being Stephen, said, brethren and fathers, listen. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he dwelt in Haran, and had said to him, get out of your country and from your relatives and come to the land that I will show you. Then he came out of the land of Chaldeans, and he dwelt in Haran. And from there, when his father was dead, he, being God, moved him, being Abram, to this land which you now dwell. Of course, they were in Jerusalem when they were talking about this. Now, in this chapter here, in chapter 7 of Acts, where it says in verse 2 at the end, before he dwelt in Haran and said to him, get out of your country, grammatically, I don't think it's possible to prove whether or not God said, get out of your country and from your relatives while Abram was in Ur of the Chaldeans in Mesopotamia, or whether he was actually in Haran much further to the north. And so as we count these instances, I am going to count as what I call ACOV 1. I use a little coding system. ACOV stands for the Abrahamic covenant. So ACOV 1 would be the first time that God showed up speaking to Abram. And I'm going to count the first time as being when he spoke to Abram when he was still living in Ur, farther to the south and in the land of Mesopotamia. Now, what had ended up happening is that after Terah died in Haran, again, God told Abram to pack up and head south. So I'm going to make an assumption here that when God said, get up out of your country, that he either said that to him when he was in Haran to the north, or he said it twice. He said it while he was in Ur, that spurred him to move north to Haran. And then he said it again when he said, now it's time to leave Haran and let's start going south, right? And those are a couple of assumptions. I just want to be upfront about those things. So again, he's up in Ur of the Chaldees. He's up in Haran, further to the north. His father Terah dies. And then he heads south, and he ends up at a place in Canaan. And Canaan would be, kind of the general area. And on this particular map, it's small because I've zoomed out so we can see Ur as well as Haran. But if we'll zoom in here in a second. So he goes down to Canaan, but he goes to a specific place called Shechem. And so we actually have 3 different instances in Genesis 12 where God appears to Abram in relationship to the Abrahamic covenant. And so the Abrahamic covenant, ACOV 1, the very first time that God spoke to Abram was, again, when he was in Ur of the Chaldees, as Stephen suggested. Now, we don't know what he said. right? Chances are all he said was, hey, you might want to head up to Haran. It's not stated, it's not recorded, but just the fact that God spoke to him in Ur is stated by Stephen. From there, Acov 2, the second time that God appeared, again, counting the first time as being in Ur, this is where God, in my opinion, says, get out of your country to a land that I will show you. And so as we go through this, what we need to do is we need to track the different elements of the Abrahamic covenant. Now, it's not stated explicitly, but when you look at each of these different iterations of the promises, there's always something said about land, there's always something said about people. And that is really what God's inheritance is, what Abram's inheritance is. Eventually, what Christ will return to inherit, it's specific land and it's specific people, right? So there's always land and people as part of that promise. So in the second instance of the Abrahamic covenant, we have a very generic land promise. God said, get out of your country and go to a land that I will show you. He hadn't told him where it was. He just probably said, pack up and start walking south. And you'll see that to the south reference several times. And usually in the Bible, if you have a center column reference, there would be some kind of a reference to the desert of Negev, Negev. So that's that big desert towards the south. Once actually you even get down below, Jerusalem and the southern part of the Dead Sea. So this is where Abram's faith really starts to kick in. We really have no idea, other than a little bit of a hint of Abram's character and nature given to us by Josephus in the Antiquities of the Jews. We don't know where Abraham's faith was. All we know is that he knew enough about God's faithfulness and his character and his willingness and ability and track record of keeping promises, that he was willing to pack everything up and just start walking without even knowing where he was going. And there have been so many different sermons, including in our ministry, where we've talked about that is the kind of faith that God is requiring of us, that we don't always know what our next steps are, but we trust God. I mean, he might give us one step, but he's not showing us things 4 or 5 steps down the road. At this point, Abram's already left 2 homes. He left Ur, he left Haran. His father died, his brother died, and he had other brothers like Nahor who stayed in Haran, right? So he left a lot behind. Now he took a lot with him, right? He was married to Sarai. He took his nephew Lot. He took servants that would have belonged to his household, as well as whatever possessions that he had that he could travel with. So that's the land promise. Again, it's very nebulous. Go to a place I will show you. It's down there somewhere towards the south. And, that's where, again, Abraham's faith kicked in. As far as the people part of the promise at this point goes, all God says to him is, I will make you a great nation. Now, we're looking backwards from our perspective. We know exactly what that means, is that out of Abram's lineage, we ended up with the Jewish nation, or, the nation of Israel. So this is what he's referring to. He's saying, I will make you a great nation. And then he goes on and he says, I will bless you, and I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. And the first thing, and probably the most important thing to understand, there's really 2 things. Number one is, what is a blessing? A blessing is really essentially divine favor. So if somebody says bless you, and we commonly use that, somebody sneezes, whatever, we say bless you. That's not really, we're not asking for God's divine favor, but that's literally is what the word means. And so if somebody pronounces in the Old Testament, sometimes you'll see the father of a large family, we'll see this later in the story of Jacob, where on his deathbed he calls all of his sons to him and he pronounces a blessing. And in some cases there's prophetic elements to this. But basically, he's calling down God's divine favor. That's what a blessing is. So God is saying, listen, if you will do what I tell you to do and act in faith, you will have my favor. You will have my divine favor. And more than that, anyone who blesses you, anyone who is kind to you and generous with you and friendly with you, I will bless you, or I will bless them as well, because of their association with you and how they're treating you. And the flip is also true. God said, I will curse those who curse you. Now, aside from understanding what the word blessing means, the next thing to understand here is that the you that's in all of these sentences, where it says, I will bless those who bless you, curse those who curse you. The you is singular. And has been for many, many decades, probably ever since at least the late 1940s, early 50s, when Israel, under the United Nations decree, became a nation again after World War II. There has been this, I guess, subsection of the Christian world that is all about blessing Israel. And if you watch TV, which I don't, but I know that there are commercials on all the time talking about supporting Israel. Now, I think that is certainly important because, yes, the Israelite people hold a very distinct place in history, as well as in God's economy and as well as his plan. But, as of this point, most of Israel is secular. Most of Israel, the nation of Israel, is not following God. And certainly most of them have not accepted Christ as their Messiah and as their Savior. And what they do is they look at this verse and say, anyone who blesses you will be blessed. And so some Christians have this thought that if they support Israel in some fashion, that God will bestow his divine favor, his blessing upon them simply because they're supporting Israel. And they go, well, Abraham became Israel, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Jacob's name was turned to Israel. So therefore, if I bless the nation of Israel, then God will bless me. And that's simply not true, because the promise was not to the nation of Israel, which did not exist yet. The promise of divine favor and blessing was given to the man Abram and anyone who blessed the man Abram. And that's as far as we can push it. Quite honestly, it's as far as we can go. So he goes on beyond that, and he says, I'm not only going to bless or curse those who bless or curse you. He says, in you, all the families of the earth, or all the families of the land, will be blessed. And what he's referring to here is, future. This is really foretelling and prophecy. He's talking about how the Messiah will come through his lineage, and once the Messiah completes his work on the cross and is resurrected, and the gospel spreads throughout the entire world, that anyone who accepts the gospel, becomes adopted into the family, becomes an heir of Abraham and co-heir with Christ. And that's what he's referring to here. But this is all very early on, right? And so I'm sure that there was some element in God's mind of thinking, well, I can't dump all the details on this poor guy all at once, because maybe he'd run screaming when he thought about the potential of what I'm asking and calling him to do. And so I think this is one of the reasons why God started with very nebulous terminology and wording, and over time continued to add some details. So from there, the third time that God shows up with Abraham, Abraham heads south from Haran to Canaan. And again, this is where he meets God at Shechem. And Shechem is in that part of the land called Canaan. And this is where he says, to you and your seed, I will give this land. Now, as far as the land portion, where he says, I will give this land, Abraham was in the area that it was known at that time, or at least at Moses' time, as Shechem. But Shechem, it's kind of interesting. You start looking at where all these different names, and of course, names of people and nations and places change over the generations. And so Shechem is not just where God met Abram for the third time. It's also where Abram's grandson Jacob dug a well, which became known as Jacob's well. It's also where later in the story, where Joseph, who was one of the children of Jacob, when he died and his bones were taken out of Egypt when the Israelites left Egypt, his bones were brought back and they were buried in Shechem. This is also the area Shechem is also where King Solomon's son Rehoboam, who was the grandson of King David, where he was crowned king of Judah, or king of Israel, after Solomon died. But that city, Shechem, was later captured by the rebels of the northern 10 tribes led by Jeroboam. And Shechem, while it had this great history with Abraham and Jacob and Rehoboam and all that stuff, eventually the northern tribes captured it and made it the capital city of Samaria, or one of the capitals, because there was actually two. Now, fast forward to the New Testament, Shechem is also known as Sychar, And this is where Jesus met the Samaritan woman at the well, which was, of course, taboo. And that's a different story that we'll get to when we get to Aries, which is the star sign of Christ in his earthly ministry. So Shechem's got a lot of history. And here we see it where God shows up for the very first time, but Shechem and Sychar keep showing up again and again and again in important parts of the story as it continues to unfold. So that's the land portion of the third iteration of the Abrahamic covenant. God goes from saying, just start walking south. I'm going to give you some land. Just go to where I tell you to go. And then he guides them to this area called Canaan, and specifically to this place called Shechem. But then he says, to you and your seed. He said, I'm going to give it, he says, to you and your seed I will give this land. And this is the first mention of a seed. Most of your Bible translations will use the word descendants, and that is typically in both the Hebrew translation as well as in the Greek Septuagint. And we have explained this before, and I know that Tim has gone through this in the Bereans lessons with our Four Winds ministry, but we have to point out that the underlying word that's translated in the plural as descendants is actually basically spermata, or it's the Greek word or the Hebrew word for sperm, and it's in the singular. And Paul in Galatians 3:16, I'm not going to ask you to go there because we've gone over this so many different times in different places, but if you're not familiar with Galatians 3:16, you can go there sometime after we're done. But Paul says in Galatians 3:16, he makes a very specific comment about this word seed. He says, now to Abraham and his seed were the promises made. He does not say, and to seeds as of many, but as of one, and to your seed who is Christ. And so when God shows up to meet with Abraham at Shechem, and he says, to you and your seed I will give this land, he's talking about a very specific descendant of Abraham who would receive that inheritance. Now, you might argue that the seed refers to Isaac, because God also said, I'm going to fulfill my promises to your father through you. You could argue that it means Jacob, because he reiterated the Abrahamic covenant to Jacob. But ultimately, at the end, the seed who is to inherit the people in the land is Christ, who is a descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So if we zoom in on Canaan, we can see where Shechem is in relationship to where Abram settled in between Bethel and Ai. So you have up here, we have Shechem. Down here, we have what I've called Camp Abram, which is, Abraham kept going back to this place several different times. And in fact, he set up camp there and lived there for some time. And we'll see the city Ai a little bit later in the story of Joshua, which is under the star sign of Sagittarius. I want you to notice, if you look at the map, that just below Camp Abram, Bethlehem is further to the south. And what is not shown here actually is the area or the city that later becomes Jerusalem. But if you see on the map there, just below Camp Abram, where it says Gihon, right above Bethlehem, that's basically where Jerusalem ends up being in the future. Now, in the rest of chapter 12, we see a famine, and we see Abram going to Egypt. And one of the princes of Egypt sees Sarah, or Sarai, and recommends her to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh brings her into his house and showers Abram with gifts. Now, if you read the story, now we're not going to read this part. What I'm going to try to do as we go through is give you a synopsis and then focus in on specific details that I think are important for us to know. Again, trusting that you're reading the entire chapter on your own. So Pharaoh brings her into his house, and he showers Abram with gifts. But what ended up happening was that when the prince approached, and I'm filling in some details here, but someone must have come to Abraham and Sarah and said, hey, Pharaoh wants Sarah back in his place. So at that point, Abram had asked Sarah, or Sarai, to lie about their relationship. They were husband and wife. And so Abram lied to Pharaoh, and he states later that he did it because he was afraid that if they knew that they were married, that they would simply kill Abram to get Sarai. And the reason for that was because Sarai was a beautiful woman. And remember, like we might look at this, and if there's about a 9 to 10 year difference between Abram and Sarai, with Abram being about 9 or 10 years older. So we're looking at Sarai being 65ish years old, maybe a little bit older. But she was still beautiful. She was beautiful enough that men would see her and would say, I think we want to have her with us. So Abram lied and asked Sarai to lie, and she did, just to protect Abram. But what ended up happening was that God brought plagues on Pharaoh and brought plagues on Pharaoh and on his house on account of Abram. So the Pharaoh goes to Abram and says, why did you do this? Look at what God is doing, your God is doing to my household. And so Pharaoh relents and asks him to take his stuff and take Sarai and leave, which they do, but they come out of Egypt a lot richer than when they came into Egypt, which is an interesting comment. You would almost think that if God is looking for a man of righteousness and integrity, that he wouldn't bless him when he lied. And I'm not saying that this story is, I'm certainly not saying that this story is teaching us that it's okay to lie to protect your own skin and God's going to bless you for doing that. I don't think that is the point. I think the point of having this story is to show that Abram wasn't perfect and that God had some work to do with him, but he had made these promises that were going to come to pass, and he needed Abram in a particular position to learn and to grow and to be able to survive in a world that eventually becomes very, very hostile towards him. So again, they come out of Egypt much richer than when they went in. And so as we move into Genesis chapter 13, we see Abram coming out of Egypt a very rich man, and he goes back to Camp Abram in between Bethel and Ai. And at this point in chapter 13, we see a very short story about how Abram's herdsmen and Lot's herdsmen get into this argument about the natural resources, whether it was grazing pastures or water for their animals, because at this point, both Abram and Lot were very wealthy men. They had a lot of servants, they had a lot of possessions, they had a lot of animals that they had to take care of. And so Abram says, listen, there's plenty of land for all of us. Why don't you pick what you want and I'll go somewhere else? So instead of Abram saying, beating his chest and saying, oh, God has blessed me and God's going to do all these great things for me, so I'm going to take my pick of the land and you can have whatever's left over. Abram does it the other way around, which is, I think, a comment on his integrity, and it's a comment on his focus on the future fulfillment of God's promise, because basically God said, I'm going to give you all of this stuff. So I think in Abraham's mind, he was okay with getting second best for a while until God could give him the best. I really do think that that's exactly what this is teaching us. But what ends up happening when Abram gives Lot the choice, Abram then settles down. He chooses, he kind of looks around and he looks to the east around the area where the Jordan is, which is on the other side of the Jordan River. And that area, the Bible describes it as being very lush and very fertile. And so Lot chooses that and he crosses over into the Jordan plain, and it talks about how he moved around and he lived in different cities around the plain, eventually working his way down towards Sodom and Gomorrah, which is on the southeast side of the Dead Sea. At least that's where we believe it to be based on some archaeological evidence. So Lot takes the pick of the choice, and then Abram says fine, and he stays in Canaan, which is where the Lord appears to him for the fourth time. So in Genesis 13, verse 14, if you'll read with me, Genesis 13, 14, and the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, lift your eyes now and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward. For all the land which you see, I give to you and your seed forever. Now this is quite interesting when you look at it. Abram had just given Lot the pick of all the land that was around, and he was perfectly content to let Lot take the plain of Jordan, which was very fertile. He was perfectly content to stay in Canaan, in around that Bethel and Ai area. And as soon as Lot disappears, God shows up and says, guess what? It's all yours. As far as you can see, including that area off towards the east where your son/nephew Lot is, it's all yours. I'm going to give it to you. He says, for all the land which you see, I give to you and your seed forever. And here we see, and your seed again. I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if a man could number the dust of the earth, then your descendants also could be numbered. Arise, walk in the land through its length and its width, for I will give it to you. So, looking at this fourth iteration of the Abrahamic covenant, starting in verse 14, as far as the land goes, we see directionality, right? He's taken them from Haran down to Canaan, and he said, hey, this area, I'm going to give it to you. But then now at this point, he says, listen, look around, look this way, look all around, all directions. I'm going to give it all. It's not just Shechem, it's not just Canaan. As far as you can see, to the north, south, east, and west, all of it will be yours. I'm going to give it to you and give it to your seed. As far as the people go, again, he says you and your seed. He identifies two specific heirs, and Paul tells us that the seed referred to is singular and it's Christ. And we'll probably deal with this in a different lesson, but if you have read much through the New Testament, and if you maybe have gotten into discussions about the gospel and how people end up coming into relationship with Christ, you may have come across this concept that, and we call this this is part of what is called Calvinism. That is this thought that God has, before he created the world, he chose who was going to be saved and who was not, and those that were going to be saved based on his pre-choice, they're called the elect. And you see the word or the phrase the elect throughout the Bible, especially in the New Testament. Well, it's not referring to how God chose people ahead of time. It refers to how God chose Abraham out of the entire world, after the flood, out of the entire world. Who did God choose to start bringing about his promises, bringing about the prophecy that was actually given in Genesis 3:15, where he curses the serpent and he prophesies how a seed of the woman is going to crush the serpent's head. And that's a foretelling of the gospel and of Christ and his death on the cross, but Christ's victory through the resurrection, that he would actually defeat death itself. Well, it all starts right here. It all starts with Abraham or Abram being called or being chosen or being elected out of all the people on the earth at this point. Who did God choose? He chose Abram. And then, we can just track down the line. He chose Abram, then he chose Isaac, then he chose Jacob, and we go down generations, then he chooses King David. And all the way through the lineage of Abraham, God made specific choices about who ultimately would be the father and the mother of Jesus the Christ, the Son of the living God. That's what election is all about. That's what the elect refers to. It does not refer to God choosing people to be saved or not before he even created the world. It just doesn't work that way. So we see again the people promise in this fourth iteration. We see to you and to your seed. But now he adds another dimension. He talks about numerous descendants that would number as the dust of the land. And this is an apt descriptor because where is he? He's in Canaan. He's not over in Jordan. Had he gone to Jordan, maybe God would have said, your descendants would be as the grass in the fields. If you could count all the different blades of grass. But no, he was in Canaan, which was arid and dry, compared to the fertile Jordan. And so I think he was just using an analogy of what was immediately available to him. Look around at all this dirt and all this dust. Your descendants are going to be just like this if you could count them all. Now, moving into chapter 14, we see war coming. Now, in terms of context at this point, what we know is that Abram is still living in and around Canaan and all these, Bethel and Ai. He's got Camp Abram there. Lot has gone to the other side of the Jordan, and he's living in the Jordan plains, and he's settled now down into the land of Sodom. But what ends up happening is that war comes out. What was going on at this time is that there was kings of different regions, and there were specifically 4 kings from the east in Mesopotamia over around that area where you have, and hopefully you'll remember some of these names from earlier lessons. We have Ur, we have Babel, we have Susa, And there was one specific king who was kind of the head of all of them, even though there were different kings around. There was one king, his name was uh, Kurdo and I may have mispronounced that, but that's pretty close. But basically, he was requiring and had been requiring tribute from 5 different kings, including the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah, as well as 3 others. But really, Sodom and Gomorrah, specifically, king of Sodom, is kind of the focal point. And so we have 4 Mesopotamian kings coming to fight against 5 kings that are in and around the Dead Sea and Canaan and Jordan. And you would think that 5 kings would be stronger with their armies than 4, but that's not really what happens, because the 4 kings that come out of the east and out of Mesopotamia conquer the 5 kings of the west, and they basically capture people, take all their possessions, their animals, their horses, their cattle, and they start going north. And they take Lot with them because they conquered the city of Sodom, and so they take the inhabitants as part of their bounty or part of their booty, and they end up going north towards the area of Dan. And so what ends up happening, if you read in the story in chapter 14, is that somebody escapes and goes to Abram and says they took Lot and they're headed north. And so what Abram does is he mounts up. He's got 318, the Hebrew translation talks about trained servants. These were men who were brought up in his household that I guess were trained for war. And he starts going north and he chases them to Dan, which is just above the Sea of Galilee, getting up towards what is now called the area of Turkey and the city of Damascus. And in fact, he chases them down to Dan and goes a little bit further just outside of Damascus. And Abram, with his 318 men, defeat the coalition of 4 kings that had defeated 5 kings. And there's only one way that happens, and that is supernaturally. That is by having God's divine favor. And this goes back to the very first promise that God gave in the first iteration of the Abrahamic covenant. He said, I will bless you. You will have my favor. And so we have 319 people going up against a coalition army of 4 different kings. And guess who wins? The one who was blessed by God and has his divine favor. So what ends up happening is he ends up taking all the stuff back, all the people back, all the animals back, and he heads back down now towards the area that would be later known as Jerusalem. And this is the area that at some point is actually called Salem, which is was a common nickname for the city of Jerusalem. Now, I understand that this city, Salem and Jerusalem, certainly didn't exist at this point. It was still just open land. It was part of, the area of Canaan. So what ends up happening is he then meets Melchizedek. And so go to Genesis 14, verse 18. We need to talk about Melchizedek just for a little bit. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was the priest of the Most High, of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abraham, or Abram, of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And he gave him a tithe of all. And verse 20 there is proof that Abram's victory was from God. It was divine. It was supernatural. It was not something that he accomplished in his own right. So the question then is who is this Melchizedek? He just pops up. This is it's not quite a parenthetical statement. It's just a handful of verses that talk about this very, very important event and talks about a character that hadn't shown up, at least in this particular form. And I'm just going to tell you right away that this Melchizedek is the pre-incarnate Christ. It's the same person who showed up in Ur to say, guess what? I'm choosing you. Head north to Haran. It's the same pre-incarnate Christ that showed up in Haran and said, get up out of your country to a land that I will show you, and I will bless you and make you a great nation. It's the same pre-incarnate Christ that met him the 3rd time and said, listen, I know that your son/nephew Lot just took the choicest portion. Look around in every direction. It's all yours. It's the same person, Melchizedek. Now, a lot of people look at Melchizedek, and I believe I had mentioned before that some of the Jews believe that he was a like some kind of a mystical supernatural being, but they don't identify him beyond that. Some people think that he was just simply a human. He was a king who was the high priest of a city called Salem. However, the city of Salem didn't exist at that point. Some people believe that he was Seth, the son of Noah, who was still alive and had become the king of the city of Salem and was the priest of God. None of that is accurate, and here's why. The word Melchizedek is not a name. Melchizedek is a title. Melchizedek is a title. Basically, it's a compound word, which is two words. The first word is Melech, which basically means king or prince, and Sedek. So Melchizedek is the compound word. And really what it means, it's a title that means king of righteousness or king of justice. And this is interpreted for us in this manner by Paul in Hebrews chapter 7, which we'll come to in just a little bit. But again, Melchizedek is a title, it's not a name. And a lot of us have probably been taught that, well, I don't know what you've been taught, but I know that I was taught initially that Melchizedek was just a person. But again, it's a title, it's not a name. Moses also calls him, as he's writing this account of Melchizedek meeting Abram, he calls him not just king of justice or king of righteousness, he calls him king of Salem. And again, it's quite often interpreted to be the king of a city called Salem, and that could certainly be true. But Salem, the word means peace. It's the same as the Hebrew shalom. So he's the king of shalom, the king of Salem, the king of peace. He's the king of justice and righteousness. He's the king of peace. Now, Psalm 76, I believe it's verse 2, does refer to Jerusalem by the nickname Salem. But that came much later than the historical events that we're talking about now. It came much later than the time of Moses, when Moses was actually writing about these things that happened well before when Moses was alive, several hundred years. So, having said that, it is also proper to interpret Salem not just as the king of peace, but also to interpret it as the king of a city. And the reason for that is because in Hebrews chapter 11, if you want to flip over there for the moment, Hebrews 11 verse 9, Paul tells us that Abraham was waiting for a city that didn't exist yet. So Hebrews 11 verse 9 says, by faith he, being Abraham, dwelt in the land of promise as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. And so the scenario that I want you to hold in your mind is that as Abram is coming back from the supernatural victory where he defeated the 4 kings of Mesopotamia and he recovered Lot as well as all the goods from the war itself, that Melchizedek, the king of righteousness, comes out. Melchizedek, the king of peace, comes out. Melchizedek, the king of the future city of Salem, meets him. And again, we know historically that the city did not exist at this point. The city initially was known as Jebus or Jebus, and this was the capital of the nation of the Jebusites, or let's say the clan of the Jebusites. And we'll see later in David's story how David captures the city of Jebus or Jebus, and he turns it into, or calls it, Jerusalem, right? So it is the same city, but it doesn't exist yet. Now, a little bit later, we'll see how God asked Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac, another pivotal story in the book of Genesis and the Abrahamic covenant. But the place where that happened, Mount Moriah as we know it, later became the Temple Mount, where the temple was in Jerusalem. It's the same city, it's the same place. And we know in the later story where Abraham is willing to sacrifice Isaac, that he goes up to the top of a mountain that God shows him. There's no city there. Can you imagine if he was trying to sacrifice his son in the middle of the town square? No, he was up there. He was in a barren plateau on top of some hill, very large hill or small mountain, and he's by himself, right? So we know again that there is no city there. Now, we also know from Moses' account that Melchizedek was the priest of God Most High. And notice what Melchizedek does. He doesn't just meet Abram, he brings out bread and he brings out wine, which later become symbols of the future covenant, right? The bread and the wine become very, very meaningful symbols in the Feast of Passover. But to you and I, we talk about communion. A lot of Christians are celebrating communion every week. We prefer to do it once a year at the annual Seder meal because that's how Christ did it, and we try to emulate that. That's how the early church did it, and we try to emulate that. So this Melchizedek, who's the king of justice and righteousness, the king of peace, the king of a future city called Salem, which doesn't exist yet, brings out the elements that symbolize the covenant that God is making with him. Now, understand this. The pre-incarnate Christ showed up in in Haran, also in Bethel and Ai, and he shows up in Shechem. It's the same person. And in fact, let me just back up here. Well, actually, let me say it this way. Every time God shows up and speaks the Abrahamic covenant and says, "To you and your seed I will give this," he's talking about himself. Because ultimately it's Christ who is the heir of the land and the people, and it's the pre-incarnate Christ who is speaking the promises to Abraham, referring to the seed, right? He's talking about himself as he's giving these details of the Abrahamic covenant. I'm not going to go there for the moment, but if you want to read through Hebrews chapter 7 and also look at the early verses, probably the first half of Psalm, I believe it's 100. Let me just check that. Give me 1 second. So Psalm 110. This is a prophecy of Christ which begins, "The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool." And he talks about Christ. Then down in verse 4, he says, "The Lord has sworn and will not relent." And he's talking about the Son. "You are a priest unto the ages according to the order of Melchizedek." Right? So Melchizedek shows up specifically in Genesis 12. Paul explains in Hebrews chapter 7 that this is the pre-incarnate Christ. He talks about how Melchizedek is without genealogy, without beginning, without end, without father, without mother, and he is the high priest. Now, a little bit later, as we go through the rest of these different star signs, we're going to talk about the Levitical priesthood, right, which is the priesthood that is, I don't know, I guess active throughout most of the Bible story up until the point where the temple was destroyed in AD 70 after, a couple of decades after Christ. The Levitical priesthood makes up or is referred to in most of the references to the Jewish priesthood throughout the Old Testament. But it's important to know that there was a priestly order that was established before Levi was called and Aaron were called to be priests. And that is the order according to Melchizedek, right? This was all these relationships and all these promises between the pre-incarnate Christ and Abraham. The priesthood that the pre-incarnate Christ served, who was the king of justice, the king of peace, the king of the future city, whose builder and maker is God, this priesthood is the eternal priesthood. The Levitical priesthood was and is a temporary arrangement. The eternal priesthood came from the pre-incarnate Christ himself. Now, what we see here at the end of, and we'll probably clue it up here at the end of chapter 14, is that the king of Sodom returns after hearing, I assume, after hearing that Abram was successful in defeating the Mesopotamian kings, and he offers for Abram he says, give me all the people, but you take all the horses. And Abram refuses. And in fact, he says specifically, I have reached out my hand and I've sworn to the God of heaven and earth that I will take nothing from any man. I won't even take a piece of leather off a sandal from someone else, because Abram at this point did not want anyone to be able to come and say, well, you got all this stuff because you got it from this guy or you took it from that guy. He wanted to be able to say, and this is, I think, part of his maturing process. He certainly was willing to take things from Pharaoh. Even though he had lied about his circumstance and his relationship with Sarai, he was willing to come out of Egypt with a whole bunch of stuff that he didn't go in with, things that he didn't really earn. But I think it shows some maturity on Abram's part, and he's not perfect. We'll see in a little bit in our next lesson that he makes some more mistakes of the same kind. But at this point, he says, listen, I know enough about the God that I serve that I only want the blessings and the provision in my life to come from him and all to his glory, right? And that's a big learning point and a growth and a maturing process that Abraham has been going through this as we continue on. So next time when we come back, we'll pick it up in Genesis chapter 15, where we see God giving the fifth iteration of the Abrahamic covenant, giving a little bit more detail about the land as well as the people. Now remember, we have several more weekends to go through, and the star sign of Virgo and the Abrahamic covenant. We still have to finish off Abraham and then fold in the discussions of the history of Isaac as well as Jacob before we can move on to anything else. So I hope you enjoyed this. Hope you learned something, and God bless you, and I'll talk to you soon. Take care.